Millennials have been accused of many things. We've been called narcissistic, impatient, and self-entitled. Are these fair accusations? We're going to have a conversation today about what it means to be a millennial and how we are changing the nation and the world. I'm Nicole Corato, and this is a CNN Philippines special presentation, Meet the Millennials.
Millennials have been described as the generation that wants it all and wants it now. But that's only one side of the story. We are also the generation experiencing the insecurities of temporary job contracts, environmental destruction, and violent conflict. How do millennials see the world today? Are we the generation that sees a world full of opportunities? Or a generation left with no choice but to find opportunities wherever it takes us?
Joining our conversation today are fellow millennials. We have Jail Cornelio from Ateneo de Manila University.
Hello, everyone.
We are also fortunate to have Mike Labayandoy from Lyceum University of Laguna. And Bads Calamba from Mindanao State University Iligan Institute of Technology. Of course, we're also fortunate to be joined by fellow millennials in the room. So thank you all for joining us. All right, let's get started. I think it's always important to talk about definitions, right?
Yeah.
Because I think if we go by the definition that a millennial is someone born between the 1980s to 1996, then everyone in this table is a millennial, except si Jail. The joke lang. He is also an aging millennial, of course, is part of it. So I think we should also start with the definition. Mike, what makes this generation particularly important? It feels like it's an arbitrary boundary, 1980 to 1996.
It is. There are confusions and there are tensions on how you would define it. I'd like to highlight two aspects. The first one is the period. If you're 18 to 41 years old today, then perhaps you're a millennial, but that's debatable. But that's not very important in my opinion. What matters more is the second concept, which is the shared experience. What makes a generation would be something about the context where they grew up. And if you examine the experiences of the millennials, one very important shared experience is the technology. If you could imagine, in the context of social media, in a span of a decade, you have various important social media. Twitter, 2010, it was launched 2010. Friendster, 2002. In between, you have YouTube, you have Facebook. So if you could imagine those young ones growing up with those types of social media platforms, that is a shared experience. That could define them as a generation.
But of course, I wonder, to what extent is it shared? Kasi diba, the way we experience being young people, the way we experience technology also varies depending where you are. So I'd like to get Bads's ideas because you've done a lot of research in Mindanao, in disaster communities, in conflict communities. I think we have to unpack sino ba yung millennial kasi there we have this impression that these are empowered, self-entitled, narcissistic teenagers. But what's the reality?
Yeah, and I would like to point out on our definition of millennials. I think it's so shallow and sometimes out of context, but we have to contextualize also that there are millennials in Mindanao, for example, who are displaced of conflicts, for example, in Marawi Siege. We have millennials who are members of the indigenous communities who are victims of militarization, and a lot of millennials living in disasters and now coping at the same time. But the point here is that aside from the technology, we all know that technology or millennials are inclined to technology, but it doesn't mean that, for example, the millennials in Mindanao are having no access to technology. But I think we also share the same experience of technology, but we have different experience when it comes to conflict and displacement of.
Right. Jail, you want to add in that?
Alam mo, Nicole, I'm very glad that you brought up that critical point, no, about people's perceptions about millennials na very celebratory, people are very positive and optimistic about the future because the hope of the motherland lies amongst our young people. The problem, however, is going back to Mike's point about shared experiences. Hindi lang actually technology, Mike. In my view, ang nagde-define ng shared experiences ng mga kabataan ngayon, people our generation and certainly the younger ones, I think, have to confront the problem of inequality. Hindi to masyadong halata if you live in Metro Manila and you're in such a wonderful campus and a beautiful place like BGC, but you factor in the rest of the country na mga kabataan na lumalaki ngayon, number one, lumaki sila na marami sa kanila ang mga parents nila OFW. Pangalawa, lumalaki sila na hindi rin sigurado, are they gonna have a very positive future because of the lack of experiences or the lack of opportunities available for them. So while we celebrate technology, we should also problematize yung situation of inequality that we have right now.
Actually, that's a very important point to raise. Kasi parang a lot of the literature we read about sino ba yung millennials, di ba? Parang we were making jokes about this, na it's the eat, pray, love generation. Na I'm not going to stay in my job for more than 4 years because I want to find myself, because I want to travel. But the reality also is millennials have to be mobile because of insecure job contracts, because we are not sure what the future holds in the jobs that we have na hindi naman permanent, right? And somehow, the world is not out there because we want to pursue these opportunities, but it's also because where we are has very limited opportunities.
I agree. And there are also studies that say millennials are having increased work hours, and then they have to manage many things at the same time. So in relation to what Jill is saying, hindi laging positive yung konsepto ng millennial. In the context of BADS in Mindanao, hindi ba? In fact, you can see disparity when it comes to being able to pay the internet. For those households who are not doing well economically speaking, it's very hard to pay the internet. Internets that are very slow.
Totoo naman yun, even how the internet is experienced is so different. Kung nagpipiso net ka dun sa sari-sari store, iba yung experience mo ng Facebook, dun sa experience mo ng Facebook na naka-iPhone 10, di ba?
Totoo. Because we're talking about definitions, no? I guess mahalaga na maintindihan natin at nung mga nanonood sa atin ngayon na yung konsepto ng millennials, in my view, is defined for us by a particular industry. And I would dare say na this is the advertising industry that presents young people as this mobile, cosmopolitan, eating, praying, and loving kind of segment.
Nothing wrong with eating, praying, and loving.
Oh, nothing wrong.
I did
Nothing
that.
wrong.
It's
The
okay.
Linawin natin
No,
yun.
the only problem, however, pag pinag-usapan natin ng millennials is that either you're this or you're not.
Right, yeah.
It's either you can eat, pray, and love or you can't. That's where the problem is. Kaya di ba pinag-usapan natin kanina before this taping na ang problem ko is that I do not actually like the word millennials because it comes with this baggage. It's almost a moral baggage that people take for granted. That if you cannot meet the expectations that you are supposed to travel the world, experience the world, pursue your passion projects, sorry, you're not creative enough, sorry, you're not passionate enough.
And therefore, you're an outsider to the category of the millennial.
Exactly.
Which is not true.
Right. That's an intense conversation just to start. Thank you for your comments. We'll be back.
I am a millennial because we have the technology to bring change for our society and nation building.
I am a millennial because I cannot do everything, but I can do something, and that is to make a difference.
This is a CNN Philippines special presentation, Meet the Millennials, and we are still joined by Mike, Bads, and Jail. All right, let's continue the conversation. One accusation is this generation is all about me, so narcissistic, walang maiambag sa bansa. Bads, of course, your work in the Center for Local Government, I would assume, belies this. What are your impressions?
Well, based on my experience, I think the definition of millennials now is an unfair accusation. I see millennials who are really passionate for nation building. I see millennials in Mindanao who initiate programs and activities for advocating peace. I have with me my colleagues from my university, the millennials, who are working for the rehabilitation of Marawi. They call for help using the technology on Facebook. I think it's an unfair accusation. At the same time, we have to really look into the different definitions of millennials in the context of what they are doing in many different provinces, in geographical locations.
Right, and I think we've also experienced this, Jail, when we conducted research after Typhoon Haiyan, right? Like a lot of millennials have also mobilized hashtags for fundraising, and I think the same
Para
is
sa
true for
bayan
Malawi.
hashtags, they use that.
Precisely. Do you remember any other insights that you've had in your research about millennials and nation building?
Millennials and nation building. Of course, alam natin na student leaders are present. Sa research ko, I worked on Catholic youth and how religion is changing in the lives of our young people today. At malinaw sa akin na it appears to be that there's a trend now that young people choose not to go to church, but they choose to become members or be active members of certain religious organizations where they could express their passion, if I may use that word. So obviously, no, kapag nagkakaroon ng bagyo, young people are there to organize themselves for
But do you
relief
have a
operations
problem
and
with
so
the
forth,
idea
yeah.
na kaya lang naman tumutulong yan kasi gusto magpa-selfie sa relief center? Is that a problem?
Gosh, thanks for bringing that up. Alam mo, yung narcissistic stereotype that these young people have today is in fact the result of growing up in an environment. Tandaan natin, when we were growing up, pati tayo, Nicole, nung lumalaki tayo, we were taught that loving ourselves was the most important thing. In fact, may kanta ka pa nga dun, diba?
I think that's a Whitney Houston song.
Exactly, it's a Whitney Houston song, right?
Yeah.
And then at school, it's always about discovering your talents and discovering your what makes you happy and so on and so forth. So the classroom, in a metaphorical sense, was flipped so that it becomes less focused on the teacher and it's focused on the student. We are that generation. And young people today are also growing up in that generation. So accusing them of narcissism is in fact an irony because it is a result of the education that they got from the previous generation.
Yeah, and I think this is also a consequence of the technological advancement which we, the millennials, we are part of.
Right. And of course, that maps on to the social life. So I think I will bring in Mike when it comes to social life because in this table, ikaw may pinaka-exciting social life, I assume. But of course, you also studied this in your thesis, right? The online dating patterns of millennials.
Online dating is very interesting. The recent data, 2017 data, at least 60%, almost 60% of Filipino youths are dating online, or at least they have dating apps.
So it's the norm.
Well, 60%, less than 60%, you could say it's a norm. Many are actually having or using dating apps. And if there are 10 millennials, then 6 are not ashamed to say that their partners, they met their partners online. We've been talking about technology. It facilitates many things. One is love, finding love online. And sa pag-aral ko, malalim siya. Kasi, for instance, sa konteksto ng mga discrete gay men, ang pagde-date online ay isang uri ng paglaya. If you're, for instance, not out, then going online, but at the same time staying in a way anonymous, then you have this certain freedom. And it gives you affirmation and belongingness. But the negative side could be, again, these dating sites are primarily visual. So for those who cannot meet the standards, it's always about the beauty and of course all the things that are, desirable about you. It's a competition, right? You're trying to find someone who wants to date you. So best foot forward.
Right, and I think that makes it a bit complicated kasi to bring in what Jail said nga earlier na parang we're used to thinking that the world revolves around us in a way because that's what we learned this in school, that we have to value ourselves, that we are important, that we have to speak up. But how do you find the young people, how do they negotiate that tension? Because on the other hand, you want to show that this is the best version of myself, but on the other hand, ang lakas din ng pressure to basically show success stories of yourself, di ba? Yung mga hashtag blessed, yung mga magagandang carefully curated Instagram pictures. So is that an authentic, real representation of who the millennials are?
Ito nga yung problema kanina, di ba? Kanina when we were starting, I was problematizing how millennials or the concept of millennials is loaded with a particular set of expectations. You have to be cosmopolitan, you have to be quite the achiever, you have to be very beautiful also, in such a way that if you don't do that, you're a loser. And I think that is how it is problematic, not only because it sets the standard for the rest of us, but also it creates feelings of inadequacy among young people.
Right.
And I want to bring that up because mental health issues are quite also the norm now for many young people.
That's right. And it's hard to achieve those almost perfect qualities, right? So the tension, I can imagine the tension among the young ones para ma-attain lang yung dinidikta ng lipunan na this is how you should look like as a millennial, right? This is how you should engage in social media.
But there are also other millennials who defy that. Na parang wala akong pakialam kung ano sasabihin ng bayan. Merong mga ganun. Na parang I just have to do my part in whatever academics, for example, and they don't care about what the society is telling about them.
Right, so while it imposes, it also allows you to negotiate, to broaden the space for self-creation. Well, that's a lot of exciting insights. When we come back, we will have some questions from our millennial audience, so please stay tuned.
I am millennial because I am uniquely different, and I'm not afraid in making huge steps for our country and for my fellow youths in engaging in the sustainable development goals for the grassroots and marginalized sectors.
Welcome back. Let's now hear from our fellow millennials. We have a question from the floor from Aya.
Some studies reveal millennials to be distinctly purpose-driven, and this search for purpose drives their decisions. However, as idealistic and as willing as we are in making significant change, not everyone has the privileges and the capacity. What do you think are the challenges millennials face today that hinder them from reaching their full potential, and how can other sectors or generations even help them contribute more to society?
Right, thank you. And I think that's a very important question considering everyone in this table is a teacher, right? So of course you deal with your students who are looking for opportunities in the future, and we see that not all students have equal opportunities to better themselves. So any thoughts on this matter? Sige, Bads.
Well, I think it's always an important discussion in the class, and we have to remind our students to check their privileges. Yeah, sometimes we forget that we have the privilege to go to school, we have the privilege to go to a best institution, but there are also other millennials who are not going to school, but they can also contribute. What we really need, I think, is to engage more with other millennials, collaborate. If you have organizations, it's a good platform to collaborate, especially those who are marginalized sectors in society.
And there are social conditions that we have to admit that delimit the opportunities of millennials. If, for example, we examine the internet access, at least according to YAP's 4 survey, access to internet use in Metro Manila is at 92%, but in ARMM, it's only at 22%. Can you imagine that disparity when the internet is so important in many ways, right? So it takes lots of cooperation on the side of the government. Which one should we prioritize? Because, you know, when it comes to opportunities, talo na agad yung ibang regions in the Philippines.
Right, and I think there's this, we were talking about the celebratory character ng millennials, but I think this generation will also be judged in terms of how we bridged inequality among different millennials, di ba?
I will have a very personal answer sa iyo, Aya. I think you brought up a very important question. Young people have to identify what they're good at. We can hijack that YOLO discourse into something, to make it more productive, to make it more meaningful for us. The problem with being online is that we always compare ourselves, as we've been talking about here, always compare ourselves to other people. I have to dress up like that, I have to be doing exactly that. If I don't do that, I'm not good enough. I think we should turn the table around in the sense that young people should pursue what they want to pursue, regardless of what other people say. When we do it that way, then we overcome the very first barrier, namely the barrier that is within us. They talked about inequalities and barriers that are structural, but I think for many young people today, the barrier is in fact very psychological.
Right, so there are social and psychological barriers. Our next question is from Bricks.
I actually have a series of questions for you guys. First, what led to the stereotypes about millennials? Do we need to be bothered by these stereotypes? If yes, what should we do to address these stereotypes about millennials? Or are there really millennials right now who are breaking those stereotypes, making a difference and contributing to our society?
Right. I think that's a very important question. Saan ba nanggagaling yung mga stereotypes that the millennials only care about themselves? My impression is all generations do that to the younger generations, but I'm not a sociologist of youth. Jail, you are.
No, actually that's true. That's exactly true. Normally sa sociology, ang pinag-aaralan natin class conflict, 'di ba? Mayaman versus mahirap. But sa sociology of generations, if I could use that, if I could phrase it this way, merong tinatawag na intergenerational conflict. As a new generation rises, the older generation that used to have the power feels very threatened by the arrival of more creative people, more passionate people, people who want to rebel against the traditions that this generation created. So the stereotype that you are narcissistic is precisely derived from this intergenerational conflict.
And in a more practical sense, pag nasa bahay ka, di ba? Kayo talaga mga kabataan kayo, kayong mga bahay kayo. You don't need to read literature. You just have to listen to people around you in the household. Makikita mo yung conflict na yan eh. Nung panahon namin, hindi naman ganyan. Because you see, at this point, I have students who are millennials, right? And then the parents will not understand. Some will not understand. I'm not saying all. But it's hard to comprehend na yung anak nila ay nagpi-Facebook at the same time nagre-review. Kasi yung professor sa Facebook pala pinost yung PowerPoint. But the point is, you are discussing as a group, you're accessing the professor's PowerPoints or reading materials, and then you're studying at the same time. So, to answer your question, our generation being stereotyped? Absolutely. They don't understand each other. They're from a different world, as we said earlier during the start of the show. It's about shared experience. That's why they don't understand. But should we reach out? Absolutely.
Yeah, and we should not be worried about the stereotypes, because these stereotypes can be used for positive ways. Like the fact that we are here talking about the millennials, it means we are aware and we are conscious of the issues the millennials are facing. And are all the millennials are narcissists and all that? Maybe we are, but I think there are also millennials who, like us, I think, who can contribute to, society's change.
Right. I wouldn't worry too much then about the stereotype. I mean, if you listen to your grandparents, or my grandparents probably would say, hindi naman kayo lumaki sa gera, hindi naman kayo naghirap, di ba?
Absolutely.
Etong generation ng parents natin, na post-war generation, hindi naman naghirap sa gera yan. So I think all, the sociology of generations literature would really say, lahat naman ng henerasyon merong angst sa younger generation. So I think we've covered so much in the past half hour, but let's start looking forward to the future. So final comments. What do you think is our generation's contribution to the world? Maybe we can start with Jail.
It's a tough question because it's always, sociologists are not trained to predict the future. Pero we can say that what's nice about society is that it's not determined. Society is shaped powerfully by the new generation. And I would invite our young people in the audience and those who are watching the show to imagine what that future looks like. Unfortunately, I do not know whether we are defining it actively. Millennials are defining it actively. I feel that there's a certain industry or other people are defining that future for us. I dare say that we define it for ourselves and for the future.
Right. Mike?
I'm very inspired by that message. Well, I'll have to end on a positive note. I know millennials are being accused of many things, but if we can remember Arab Spring, the fight for democracy, they turned to Twitter. The young ones turned to Twitter to fight dictatorship, monarchy, and in our own backyard, let's not forget the Million People March. It happened on Facebook. It's so spontaneous. Many young ones participated there. So wag natin, I think, husgahan yung millennials na narcissistic all the time. Kasi lahat ng generation ay may ganyang tendencies, hindi ba? But I am very positive about how this generation can utilize technology to promote equality and the love for self, right? Perhaps the love for self is not bad because, you also get to love the society.
Right. Thank you, Mike. And Bads, finally?
First and foremost, I think we have to revisit the institutional crisis that we have
Yeah.
for us to really be able to identify the strengths of the millennials. So in my understanding, when Rizal said youth is the hope of our nation, we're already in 2018. I think Rizal said that 100 years ago. So I think we have to believe that youth now is not anymore the hope of this nation, but we are the solutions to the problems of this country. So we have to collaborate, we have to engage, and I think I am very positive of how the government increased the qualifications of the Sangguniang Kabataan when we allowed these older millennials maybe to take part in the Sangguniang Kabataan, I think of 20 plus. So it's a good opportunity, you know, to influence yung mga kabataan natin na we have a lot more to do to contribute to nation building.
Thank you. And that brings us to the end of our CNN Philippines special presentation, Meet the Millennials. Thank you, Jail. Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Bads. And thank you to the millennials who joined us here today. The conversation continues online, but for now, we'd like to say goodbye and thank you for joining us. I'm Nicole Curato for CNN Philippines.
I learned more about, what our potential is as millennials and even as youth of this country. And I think that, sometimes we tend to forget that, we're not just those narcissistic, lazy people. We're more than that. And, we can actually make a change by having a voice.
You're still watching the CNN Philippines special presentation, Meet the Millennials, and we're live on Facebook. All right, let's continue the conversation. Nabitin ba kayo in the conversation earlier?
Sobra.
Any
Kulang yung 30
other
minutes.
comments that you really, really want to say? Bads, anything you want to add?
I think the 30 minutes is not enough, but I think we can have more discussions by asking questions. I think
Okay, yeah.
maraming gustong itanong. No?
Right, I think the people at our back have questions. Does anyone want to say something? All right, just introduce yourself, please, so everyone on Facebook knows you.
Okay, hi, I'm Aria Navarro. I'm a senior high school student here in Anderon Colleges. So my question is, does millennial behavior affect or influence the behavior of other generations as well? And if yes, in what way?
All right, how do we affect other generations? And I think we're talking about the generations ahead of us and the generation after us, which is not yet defined, diba? We still don't know what to call them, Generation Z, digital natives, or
Post-millennial.
Post-millennial, right. Anyone who wants to take that question? Such a hard question, by the way.
Ako, very, very quickly. Are you religious? Are you religious? Do you think your peers are also religious? Not all. The older generation perceives that your generation, or our generation, is not as religious as they were. That affects them. So the institution is trying its best, the Catholic Church is trying its best to reach out to you, but at the same time, other religious groups are taking advantage of the environment now. You see the rise of other groups, evangelicals, Iglesia ni Cristo, ang Dating Daan, if you're a member of that, or Apollo Quiboloy in Davao, and so forth. So this is how we are affecting. So if you think of this in these terms, institutional terms, makikita mo na, other institutions are fighting for a piece of you.
Right, so parang battleground
Yep.
ang generation ng millennials now. Mike?
Well, I agree with Jail because institutions tend to preserve what is essential for the survival of the society. And many generations are characterized as daring, lalo na pagpapausbong na sila, napaka-daring ng mga millennials na ito. I agree with Jail. In a way, how the other generations see you is very much important.
Pero yung sexual behavior, kasi that's your research,
Yeah.
how does it affect other generations?
If you would analyze, older generations are not really open about dating online.
No.
Those who are younger, they are open to that. So you can see that there's really difference in terms of preference in the use of the internet in dating online. And therefore, the acceptability also is different.
Right.
And as I said, it's more daring, di ba? Or siguro nga yung trabahong pambahay, baka ma-skandalo yung ibang matatandang magulang na, are you really working? Or they're wondering, are you
Or
really
bakit
working?
nasa bahay ka lang?
Exactly.
Flexible working arrangement
Exactly.
is nasa bahay lang.
Exactly. And many other than dating, working, work from home as they call it, these are really different from how our parents, for instance, lived. So therefore, it really affects you, you know? You have to explain all the time. You have to let them understand, let them know what's happening.
Right, yes. Do we have more questions? Yes, all right.
My name is Shara, and I'm the External Vice President of the Student Government of Enderun Colleges. So us millennials, we're merely seen as a trend to previous generations that is soon to pass, and they don't necessarily treat us with the same respect based from the people from their same generation as well, as you've mentioned about the intergenerational conflict. So my question to you is, how do we progress as millennials, as a piece of advice, from the negatively attached term itself, and how can we be the future when we don't even be seen as the future ourselves?
Right, I think I'll unpack the last part of the question. We're not the future. The bulk of the workforce in the Philippines now are millennials. Bulk of OFWs now are actually millennials, right? We are the present. And I think that's why the conflict with the older generation is there, because of all the changes that we are bringing in with the way we do work. But I think, and this also ties in the question earlier about the relationship with the earlier generation, let's not forget na yung karanasan ng millennials ngayon sa trabaho, kagagawan din naman yan ng previous generation. Bakit uso ang labor contractualization ngayon? Bakit uso ang endo? Bakit uso yung mga nagtatrabaho na walang benefits? Intergenerational yan eh. We're experiencing the legacy of an economic system na earlier generation din ang gumawa. And I think to answer your question, the challenge for the millennials who are very much experiencing the insecurities in the labor market, the challenge is, so anong gagawin natin? Now that millennials own startups, now that millennials own big companies, how are millennials changing the workplace to make it more fair, to make it more inclusive? I think the responsibility is on us. The previous generations, like what we mentioned, will always have a tension with the younger generations. But I think millennials are accountable to the future generations also. And I'm not just talking about 10-year-olds, 5-year-olds. I'm talking about people who are not born yet, right? We are the generation who can do something about climate change. Kasi kung wala tayong gagawin about climate change, baka wala ng future generation. That is on us. Bads, anything you want to add?
Well, I've witnessed millennials who are already starting to make change in this society. So I am more particular on how do we use the privileges that we have now to work, right, on protecting environment, saving the lumad schools, for example, or making the government accountable for, not good policies. That, for example, war on drugs, for example, we have to question a lot. I think it does not need to be necessarily like concrete for now. I think we have to start for the concepts. We have to start for conceptualization. And then later on, let's have more collaborations to put concretely measures to answer what should we need to answer, especially for the preparation of the future generations, for our sons and daughters.
But I also think there's a lot to learn from the earlier generations. Like what I admire from our mentors in the academe is the patience. Diba? Para ngayon kasi when we do research, Google is so easy. Can you imagine the previous generation
Going
where
to the
that they really
library.
had to go to the library, photocopy everything one by one, and then to organize a database is so difficult. So I admire the patience, the grace, the wisdom. So I don't think it has to be a very tense relationship parate, because there's also a lot to learn from the previous generation who did not enjoy the technologies that we're enjoying today.
And, you know, again, we weren't able to clarify earlier, kahit yung henerasyong millennial, magkaiba rin yan. May mas matandang millennial, merong mas batang millennial. Yung mas batang millennial, hindi na siya nakapaglaro sa labas. Well, because wala nang park, wala nang kalsada.
Wala ng public space.
But yeah, me as a millennial, I also watched TV, I played in the streets. Later on, I learned how to use the internet. And when I was in high school, I read Randy David in the library, and I would have to manually select the books. So meaning, also I was trained that way. Hindi lahat ng millennials ay pare-pareho.
Right.
And the regional aspects, right? Just like what you were saying earlier, yung opportunities, and some in your community would rather use the cell phone in terms of emergency, right? It's not always the internet in that context. So, medyo complex talaga siya.
Right.
There's not one easy way to understand this generation. Right?
Pero having said that, it's very important na yung mga kabataan or our generation, we are also aware of where we are and our own limitations and the forces around us that shape us. Very concretely, we are in the university because we want to get employed.
Yeah.
We are taking management degrees. Many of us here are taking management degrees because we want to land good jobs and be in high-flying positions and pursuing careers that are very competitive. That's nice, but that's also dangerous. What makes it dangerous is the fact that it detaches you, to use that word, it detaches us from the big questions that are affecting our world today. Nicole mentioned yung climate change, or war on drugs is another issue, and so forth. But because we're so engrossed with submitting our term papers and making sure that we get good grades, we don't get to confront the big questions. To answer that question, Char, the point is you need to help yourself ask the big questions.
And I think concretely, you have to challenge your teachers also, di ba?
Also, yes.
And I think,
Yes.
yeah, we're all teachers in this table, and I think increasingly we feel the pressure then to link the issues we discuss in the classroom na hindi lang siya atomized, isolated, na,
Or intellectual
or
conversations
intellectual
lang.
conversation na ang basehan ng pagkatao mo ay yung grades. Right? Because I think rant natin to lahat na parang, bakit umaapila sa grades ang mga students? Bakit nagpapabago ng grades? But if we broaden our perspective, kasi kailangan nila ng mataas na grade kasi ang hirap ng trabaho ngayon, right?
Exactly.
So I think that conversation, that experience we have in the classroom is very much connected to what happens outside.
Yeah.
Let's try to get more comments from the floor. Yes? Just please introduce yourself.
So, hi, I'm Bella Del Rio. I'm the secretary of the Endurance Student Government. So, I wrote my question. So, there are several rants about the EJ case and how human rights are on the line. And there are still marginalized people from the millennial generation who are affected mentally because of the EJ case that are done to their parents and other stuff like that. So, how do you suggest that we millennials combat issues like these? And do you actually think there's a hope for this nation?
That's a very, very important question because I think it reframes the conversation.
Yeah.
When we read articles about millennials, we always have this idea nga of empowered young people working in BGC or Cebu City, di ba? But let's not forget na yung mga namatay sa war on drugs, karamihan sila are in their 20s, in their 30s, they are young fathers, they are boyfriends, they are sons, right? So the casualties ng war on drugs are millennials. And if we broaden the discussion even further, let's not forget that a lot of people that are classified as terrorists now also belong to that generation. And they use technologies to enable their networks. It's not so new or it's not so novel to realize that terrorists have WhatsApp groups, that they use Telegram also. And I'm bringing in the conversation to demonstrate the breadth, kung gaano kalaki yung category ng millennials and how we're all connected by technology, but how we differently use technologies as well. And I think the message I want to send here in relation to what you're saying is that millennials are not a privileged generation. You're right, it's a marginalized generation also. It's a generation of insecurity. And sometimes, parang the desire to find oneself happens in the form of extremism. Sometimes it happens in the form of, let's say, finding new religions. In some contexts, it means joining more artistic, creative outlets, right? So, kanya-kanyang outlets yan of overcoming, but also expressing how marginalized you are.
Of course, if you're so marginalized, how would you expect those people to proactively really give solutions? They're so concerned with their lives. I remember, just briefly, my study about ALDA. they're accused of being mababaw. And I realized that many followers are OFWs. And you'd imagine they're in a precarious condition, And then because of this uncertainty, they would watch the show that would remind them of home.
Yeah.
Therefore, you can see that hindi mo pwedeng hingin sa kanya yung hindi niya kayang ibigay dahil nga asahan mo pa ba yung mga kabataan niya na mag-mobilize kung sila mismo, as you were saying, Nicole, api or something. So I guess sobrang daming complications nung just what you said. Ang mga millennials ay biktima rin ng EJK, wala rin sila sa school, sila yung nagtitiis sa mahirap na working condition abroad, no, at wala silang choice. So it's hard therefore to expect them to just say, oh, this is the right thing to do. Get yourselves ready and mobilize and do something.
Actually, I'm glad you raised the OFW issue. I mean, technically, I'm an OFW. I work in a university in Australia. And I remember nung nangyari yung case ni Mary Jane Veloso, but a woman who was accused of trafficking drugs in Indonesia and she was almost sentenced to death penalty. Parang yung pakiramdam ko nun, I could have been her. That could have been me holding that suitcase. Ano lang yung kaibahan namin? Swinerte ako, hindi ako pinanganak na ganon kahirap. Diba? Minalas lang siya. And I think, yung ganong konteksto na magka-generation kami. Halos magkapareho kami ng edad. Pareho kami ng life circumstances na bumabiyahe abroad, pero minalas siya. So I think mahalaga na i-bridge yung ganong connection na you have this highly mobile millennials who can work anywhere in the world. They can work in New York and then London and Dubai. But there are millennials who really have no choice but to accept a very dangerous job in a very dangerous place, not because the world is so full of opportunities, but it's because wala namang opportunities sa Pilipinas right? So I think that question is really, I think, very personal, very political, and obviously very important. That's.
Well, my take on it is that ang problema kasi sa society ngayon, halimbawa yung mga kabataan na nagrarally against EJKs, when they have creative slogans, nagrarally on the streets, they were also labeled as, pang ano lang to, mga nanggugulo lang kayo, nag-iingay lang kayo, That's something the society missed a lot. That, that we, the millennials, have voices, and we are starting to wake up.
Bella, you have a voice. You are, I mean, not physically, literally, but metaphorically. You are in a privileged position, being in a fantastic campus like this, privileged education, and so forth. I would dare you to speak on behalf of those who don't have the same access of education that you do. In other words, in my view, hindi natin pwedeng asahan yung mga mas nakakatanda na tutulong sa atin. Kinakailangan nating i-consolidate yung efforts natin. A generation is defined by how it creates solidarity amongst its members to fight a common enemy. The problem today is that we have so many enemies. Sometimes they're physical, sometimes they're internal, sometimes they're social. So we're confronting so many enemies. But if we could consolidate our efforts, EJK, for example, human rights, fighting for those who are being killed as we speak, we have a voice. 50% of this population, the Philippine population, falls below about 24 or 29, if I'm not mistaken.
We have time for a few more questions. Does anyone, okay, we have one at the back and two in front. Maybe we can collect the questions all together and we can tackle them at once. Please introduce yourself.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Christian Valdez, alumnus of Enderon. Well, I mean, as millennials, I mean, of course we have to learn from somewhere. So our foundation typically has been set by previous generations, but it's also our, how would you say, our environment. So I mean, like, let's look at the Philippines. I mean, we have, I guess, how would you put it? We are having problems with certain areas of education. For example, sexual education. So I mean, for us to improve, especially you said earlier with social media and dating apps and everything, there is a spread of like pregnancy, STDs and everything. So how can we bridge that if our foundation hasn't actually given us the education for that?
Right, thank you. And if you don't mind, can you pass the microphone in front? We also have questions. Please identify yourself.
Hi, I'm John Tamayo. I am from 2030 Youth Force and World Youth Alliance. in these organizations and in relation to Miss Bella's question, I've noticed some millennials to be too idealistic to dream that they can change the world. So my question is, how do we motivate the millennials to see what is really on the ground, to see the world again, and to contextualize their aspirations?
All right, thank you. And finally,
My name is AG. I'm also a member of the 2030 Youth Force in the Philippines. So my question is related to having a voice. So apparently we have, as a millennials, have a voice, especially in social media. But at the same time, we are bombarded by misinformation and fake news, where in some instances, we became the purveyor. The millennials became the purveyor of fake news. Do you think we still have some ways we can change this perspective of the youth, that they must, even though they have the technology, they must identify that, hey, this is the truth, and it must be distributed to a wider audience. That's all.
all right, that's a lot to take in. I will start with Mike, dun sa first question about sexual education.
But before sexual education, what really provoked me is the question on who will mentor the generation. It's a struggle because there are things that you have to face na hindi naman naranasan ng kabilang henerasyon. Tulad ng explosion ng technology, ang bilis-bilis ng buhay, hindi mo malaman fake ba yan o hindi, as you were saying. At di naman sila trained sa ganon. Therefore, walang magtuturo sa'yo. You have to figure it out on your own. And that is very, very problematic. Well, fortunately, we have data like the YAFS4 survey, although it's in 2013, diba? As nag-increase ang sexual activities, pero bumababa yung awareness on HIV at yung knowledge sa sex. So inversely proportional, the relationship is inversely proportional, and it's not being talked about at home. Only less than, I think, 10% would talk about sex at home. What's also encouraging in this generation is that they're willing to talk about things. And when it comes to sex, education, and things that are hard, then I think the key is to talk about it. You have to talk to other people about it. And of course, there are structures out there that the government needs to do. Our age law is, of course, very, very, very pressing, and we really have to embrace that.
I think what I want to add to that one is, for a lot of sensitive issues like sexual health, for example, people turn to the internet to have that discussion. Now, there is an impression na pag sa internet pinag-usapan, fake news na, or you don't get credible information. But let's also not forget that sometimes social media like Facebook, sometimes Reddit, threads, are being used to exchange very sensitive information. I'm reminded of what a friend was telling me about postpartum depression. Right? Young mothers who are also millennials find empathy and support among these groups online. Dati naman, hindi masyadong pinapag-usapan yung postpartum depression because it's so sensitive, it has to be personal, dapat bago kang panganak, dapat sobrang saya mo. But now, the internet opened up that space to talk about these sensitive issues. And the same is true for suicide, the same is true for mental health. So parang, preno muna when people say sa internet lang galing yan. Because sometimes the discussion groups among anonymous people also help, diba, the millennials to find a conversation partner na hindi mo makukuha face-to-face because you feel a bit awkward about it, right? Bads, we got a lot of questions. Which one do you want to answer?
But I think I would like to look into the idealistic side. Siguro kasali na rin yung how do we millennials para be motivated of all that, because we are too idealistic and we have a lot of issues to answer in the society. I think based on my experience, the best way to be motivated is to talk with fellow millennials, is to talk with the fellow youth. Our experience with the youth, for example, the Sangguniang Kabataan and my colleagues with other activities, we question, parang hindi ako naniniwala sa mga ginagawa natin. I question what we are doing. Are we doing this for real? Is really to help the youth? But at the end of the day, at the end of the training, at the end of the activity, we realize that it's a really important mechanism to talk with the youth, to the fellow youth. We have not yet fully reached kung ano kailangan nating i-reach, but I am sure talking to the fellow millennials is the best way to address issues.
I want to answer John's question. John, tama? John, ganda na tanong mo. How do we contextualize aspirations? I really don't know. Pero,
Sagot eh.
parang ang talino, di ba? Pero hindi pala. Okay. I want you to think about it in this way, okay? You are not expected to solve the world's problems. This is the problem I have also with this expectation that young people are left on their own to address all the problems that they are confronted with, from climate change to gender equality to HIV and so forth. Impossible. Therefore, how do we contextualize aspirations? Contextualize issues. All of us get to travel. I think we have the resources to travel. Let's go around, let's travel, let's expose ourselves to the realities of inequality sa bayan natin. Nicole and I, we've been traveling around and we've done a lot of, we're doing a lot of research right now sa Visayas at saka sa Mindanao. And yung pagbisita namin sa Marawi, long before the siege happened, exposed us to the beauty, but also to the conflict that was already taking shape in Marawi. And if you ask us right now, we're doing a lot more, hopefully a lot more in the years to come for our partners in Marawi. Who thought that I, a professor from Ateneo de Manila, would one day be actually engaging Marawi people? That was far-fetched many years ago, but it became possible because I was exposed to it. You contextualize aspirations, in other words, if you already know the issues very well. And you can only know the issues very well if you immerse yourself with the people who confront these issues.
Yeah, I think I just want to add to that. Ang ganda kasi ng question na parang idealism can be a good and a bad thing.
Yeah.
Pag ang taas kasi ng expectations, tas hindi na-achieve, mas mabilis tayong ma-disappoint. But I think it also matters ano yung relationship natin with our ideals. Sometimes, nagiging problema natin sa Pilipinas in particular, we don't have the capacity to aspire. Ambition. When we go to the slum communities, to the poorest communities, whether this is an evacuation center in Marawi or a slum community in Quezon City, I think the most depressing thing is when we talk to young people at tatanungin mo, anong pangarap mo sa buhay? Sabi nila maging security guard or maging sex bomb dancer. Walang masama sa pagiging security guard or maging sex bomb dancer or maging bahagi ng Mocha Girls. Walang masama doon. We love the arts, we love the security sector. But yung parang merong mentality na nagsasabi na hanggang dyan ka lang. Bakit hindi ka pwede maging astronaut? Bakit hindi ka pwede maging presidente? Bakit hindi ka pwedeng maging inventor ng bagong Facebook, right? The capacity to aspire is important, and I think that's where the importance of idealism kicks in. Everyone says libre mangarap. Actually, may cost siya eh.
That's true.
Kasi natatakot yung maraming kabataan ngayon na baka pag umasa ako, madidisappoint ako. And I think we have to fight that. And I think that's our roles as millennials, especially millennials who are privileged. Hindi tayo i-judge kung ano yung naimbento ng generation natin, pero i-judge tayo kung paano natin naiangat yung kapwa natin millennials at yung mga susunod na henerasyon. All right, we have to wrap this up. Final comments, final thoughts?
Parang mahirap, no, na pinag-uusapan natin yung henerasyon natin kung anong magagawa natin sa future. Pero I think we have to keep engaging and get involved all the time, whatever capacities you have.
All right, Mike?
Well, I think I'd go back to the concept of a generation as a shared experience. I like what you are all saying na kailangan naiintindihan mo ano yung problema para masolusyonan mo to. Hindi kailangan yung lahat ng problema ng daigdig. Kung may isang focus ka lang, you want to focus on gender, you want to focus on this social problem, then it's okay. For me, a generation is a shared experience. Therefore, I also realized, I realized that those who are privileged enough needs to understand their fellow millennials and then reach out. It's their duty, no, to go ahead and, since they're empowered, to help others. And I hope this show is an avenue to at least, reach those millennials who are able.
Yes, thank you, Mike. Jail?
Siguro, sana yung conversation natin, mga isang oras na tayo nag-uusap, hindi siya naging debilitating for us later on na parang, oh my gosh, inequality, conflict, climate change, gender inequality, and so on and so forth. I'll just die. Diba? Or
Well, we will all die.
We will, yeah, in
And parang,
the long run.
parang akala ko ba ang topic millennial? Social problem pala.
Social problem, diba?
Yeah.
Social problem pala. Pero yun nga yung realidad eh. Pero I hope na sa pagninilay-nilay natin, tinuturo ng mga sociologists, namin mga professors ng sociology, na ang lipunan ay nililikha rin natin. So, ibig sabihin, may kapasidad tayo. Marahil, mahalaga na sa panahon na ito, at this point in time of our lives, no, you're about to graduate, some of you are going to be entering the workforce soon. I hope that you will not lose sight of the most important things about living, and that is to help other people. Hindi na siya famous right now, yung you only live once, yung YOLO. The problem I have with that is that it's sometimes taken to mean in a very hedonistic sense. Take drugs or whatever, parang abuse yourself, right? Kasi you only live once and then you die tomorrow. But if we reframe it in a very positive light, you only live once, therefore make it count. That changes everything for us, in my view.
All right. Well, thank you for those inspiring words. I hope everyone is inspired as well. And I think we have to wrap this up. So thank you all for watching us on Facebook Live. This is a CNN Philippines special presentation. Meet the Millennials. See you again.